Hello, Namaskar. This is Firstpost and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. It's International Yoga Day. I'm sure you've seen the pictures and social media hashtags and posts and WhatsApp forwards. It's truly a global celebration. But what does it mean for India? How does yoga boost India's soft power and what can New Delhi do to build on it? We'll discuss that tonight. Also, India's Tibet policy. Is it being recalibrated? Prime Minister Modi has hosted the US delegation that just met the Dalai Lama. In China, Xi Jinping is visiting a Tibetan school and temple. Meanwhile, Bangladesh Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina is in India for the second time in 2 weeks. We'll tell you what's on the agenda. Will China use nukes against Taiwan? The Americans asked them. We'll tell you what their response was. How Putin's visit to Asia has rattled American allies in the region. Is Israel heading into a war with the Hezbollah? Can it afford a two-front war? What is the Senegalese president doing in France? Why Kenya is witnessing deadly protests? How weight loss drugs are changing the food market? And what is gender washing? A new survey shows how companies only talk of equality but do not do very much to ensure it. All this and more coming up. The headlines first. Armenia announces its recognition of the state of Palestine. The move follows a similar decision by Norway, Spain and Ireland last month. Israel summons the Armenian ambassador to register a protest. Now 145 countries recognize a Palestinian state. Iran has summoned the Italian ambassador who represents Canadian interests in Tehran. Iran is upset that Canada has listed the Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist entity. Tensions have been high between the two countries, which broke off diplomatic ties in 2012. Since then, Ottawa's interests in Tehran have been represented by Italy. The new leader of Solomon Islands to visit Australia this weekend. It will be his first visit there as Prime Minister after he replaced pro-China leader Manasseh Sogavare in May. Security issues will be on top of the agenda. In 2022, the Pacific nation signed a secretive pact with China, which set alarm bells ringing in the West. A big win for the LGBTQ community in Namibia. A top court strikes down colonial-era laws criminalizing same-sex relationships. Namibia gained independence from South Africa in 1990, but has still retained most of its laws, which date back to 1927. And youth activists win a landmark climate settlement in Hawaii. The U.S. state will now be forced to move towards a zero-emission transportation system. Officials in Hawaii will also have to release a roadmap on how to achieve this goal by 2045. Today is all about an Indian success story, yoga. It is many things rolled into one. It's a trend, a lifestyle, a tradition, a culture and a science. It is also India's gift to the world. This project began in 2014. Prime Minister Modi's government proposed a resolution at the United Nations. It called for June 21st to be declared International Yoga Day. It's been 10 years since that declaration. In this time, yoga has grown a lot. Today, the world celebrates this day. The whole world celebrates it. The Prime Minister himself was in Jammu and Kashmir. As always, he joined other yoga enthusiasts. Take a look at this.
यह आसन साइड का कमर दर्द जैसे शिकायतों को दूर करता है और श्वास छोड़ते हुए दोनों पैरों को नीचे लेके आइए।
The Indian military also joined in. Soldiers performed yoga at their postings, from the snow-capped mountains of Himalayas to the deserts of Rajasthan to aircraft carriers at sea. It was truly a nationwide celebration. Not just India, Yoga Day is a big deal outside the country as well, especially in the West. Yoga culture has caught on well in countries like the United States. In fact, Prime Minister Modi marked last year's Yoga Day in New York. This year too, events were organized there. Take a look.
One more big breath. Feel it laying through the sides of your waist. From here, hand comes to the forward through for cobra pose. Exhale, curl the toes, take it to downward.
So that was Yoga Day in a nutshell. A lot of events across the world, plus some great pictures. But tonight, we're going beyond the optics. What has yoga done for India's brand? How has it helped India diplomatically? First, let's look at some numbers. Globally, around 300 million people regularly do yoga. That's more than 8% of the world population. Many of them do it at home, but some also prefer studios. There are more than 48,000 yoga studios in the US alone, more than 2,000 in Canada, more than 4,000 in Britain, and more than 2,000 in Australia. It tells you how popular yoga is. All this reach also means that yoga is a money spinner. You have the studios, you have yoga mats, you have instructors, and put together, it is a big economy. The yoga market is worth $107 billion. And it's growing at nearly 9.4% per annum. Yoga mats alone are a big business. Its market size is nearly $14 billion. So to sum it up, yoga is popular and lucrative. But how has it helped India? In broadly two ways. One is the messaging. Yoga has popularized Indian philosophies, whether it's tolerance or harmony or non-violence or honesty. It's like a window to Indian-ness. And that's very important today. We live in times where propaganda is rampant. Rivals are always trying to defame you. So it is important to tell your side of the story, and yoga can do that. It tells people what real Indian values are. Benefit number two, it has boosted India's global standing, not just as a country, but as a civilization. Look at how complex yoga is, how scientific the poses are. All of this was developed thousands of years ago. It tells you how advanced ancient India was. At the same time, yoga has embraced change. Look at all the new types of yoga. You have hot yoga, you have yoga with puppies, yoga with goats, and couples yoga. And India has never questioned any of these new types or methods. Instead, we have accepted them. And by doing that, yoga's reach has expanded. Reports say India is planning another move to boost yoga's popularity, and that is inclusion in the Olympics. India is bidding for the 2036 Games. It is pushing for the inclusion of 6 disciplines. Among them is yoga. Well, it's not clear how yoga competition will unfold, but if successful, it will boost India's and yoga's popularity. The question is, what more can be done? Yoga tourism is one avenue. It's already happening in some parts of the country. Prime Minister Modi also talked about it.
आप देखिए, भारत में ऋषिकेश, काशी से लेकर केरला तक योग टूरिज्म का नया ट्रेंड देखने को मिल रहा है। दुनिया भर से टूरिस्ट इसलिए भारत आ रहे हैं क्योंकि उन्हें भारत में ऑथेंटिक योग सीख रहा है। आज योग रिट्रीट बन रहे हैं, योगा रिसोर्ट बन रहे हैं, एयरपोर्ट में, होटल्स में योग के लिए dedicated facilities बनाई जा रही है।
The pitch should be simple. Come to India to learn authentic yoga. But that also needs investments, more yoga centers, more travel facilities, and more instructors. But if India cracks it, There is a lot of money to be made. The global wellness tourism market is huge. It's worth almost $814 billion. $814 billion. A second focus should be diplomacy. Right now, the focus on yoga disappears after Yoga Day. It doesn't extend to India's normal diplomatic engagements. Maybe New Delhi can rethink that. Other countries regularly leverage their soft power. Finland has sauna diplomacy. China has panda diplomacy. France has food diplomacy. Brazil has football diplomacy. So why can't India build a new brand of yoga diplomacy? It fits India's policies too, flexible and peace-loving. So my point here is quite simple. Every year, Yoga Day brings the same pictures and headlines, and yes, a lot of goodwill for India. But after 10 years, it is time to leverage that, to get some tangible benefits from yoga. If India doesn't do it, others will. Political messaging comes in many shapes, from a yoga pose to a social media post like this one. That's Prime Minister Modi with a group of American lawmakers. They met the Dalai Lama earlier this week, and then they met the Indian Prime Minister along with India's National Security Advisor Ajit Doval. This delegation had both Republican and Democrat leaders, including former US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. New Delhi has not issued a detailed statement about the meeting. All we have is this post on the official handle of the Indian Prime Minister. It says, the Prime Minister, I'm quoting, the Prime Minister had a very good exchange of views with friends from the US Congress. That's all. And yet, it's quite a statement. The US is poking China on Indian soil. It is calling out Beijing's rights abuses in Tibet, and India is quietly facilitating all of this by giving these American lawmakers a platform.
Understand this. His Holiness the Dalai Lama, with his message of knowledge and tradition and compassion and purity of soul and love, he will live a long time and his legacy will live forever. But to you, President of China, you'll be gone and nobody will give you credit for anything.
Xi Jinping got the message, and he's issued a response in the form of a visit to Qinghai in western China, where he held engagements with Tibetans. The Chinese president visited a middle school for Tibetans. He also went to a temple, the Buddhist Hongzhou Temple. It is a Tibetan Buddhist heritage site. Beijing released some pictures from the visit along with a statement. During this visit, Xi Jinping also met with some Communist Party officials and government representatives. And what did he discuss with them? The need to sinicize religion in China. To sinicize is to make something Chinese in character and form. Beijing wants to sinicize religion by taking away the unique aspects and giving it Chinese characteristics. They also had a message for the Dalai Lama.
所谓的西藏流亡政府是一个彻头彻尾的分裂。
The so-called Tibetan government in exile is an out-and-out separatist and political group. With regard to the contacts and negotiations between the Chinese government and the 14th Dalai Lama, our policy is consistent and clear. The key is that the 14th Dalai Lama must fundamentally reflect on and thoroughly correct his political views.
关键是14世达赖。
Now, the message is loud and clear. Xi Jinping will not accept any other version of Buddhism other than the one that he has complete control over, where loyalty to the Communist Party is supreme. He stressed on the same point in 2021 during a visit to Tibet, his first visit as the president of China, and a very significant one. For the first time in 3 decades, a Chinese president was visiting Tibet. Xi Jinping's plane landed in Ningxi, a city which is less than 20 kilometers from the border with India, the Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh. It's along this border. Now, the visit coincided with the 70th anniversary of Tibet's takeover. Of course, China doesn't call it a takeover. They call it the peaceful liberation of Tibet. No one believes them because the world knows the truth. China took Tibet by force. In 1951, Chinese troops invaded Tibet. It led to the signing of the 17-point agreement. This agreement was forced upon Tibetan leaders. The pact guaranteed autonomy for Tibet and religious freedom for Buddhists. In return, China was allowed to set up a civil and military headquarters in Lhasa. Now, throughout the 1950s, the Communist Party faced widespread resistance in Tibet. China refused to honor its promises of autonomy. In 1959, Tibetans led a mass uprising against them. It was violently crushed by the Communist Party. This forced the Dalai Lama to leave, along with some 80,000 Tibetans. They left. They came to India, and India gave them refuge. They were allowed to stay in Dharamshala in Himachal Pradesh, where they established the Tibetan government in exile. This week, American lawmakers went there to meet the Dalai Lama. Washington is bringing Tibet back on the geopolitical radar. It's a way to build pressure on China. Recently, American lawmakers also passed a law. It's called the Resolve Tibet Bill. It basically calls on China to resolve the Tibet issue. It demands that Beijing open a dialogue with the Dalai Lama. But American laws aren't binding on China, and it has swiftly rejected this demand. But the law is still important. Apart from political messaging, it has financial implications. This bill authorizes the US government to use money to counter Chinese disinformation. Disinformation about the history of Tibet, the Tibetan people, and their institutions. Also, disinformation about the Dalai Lama himself. So this law is a valuable tool to challenge Chinese narratives about Tibet, including the claim that Tibet was liberated peacefully. US President Joe Biden is yet to sign this bill into law, but that's just a formality. And India, too, appears to be making a shift here. It seems more willing to work with like-minded partners and taking steps to build pressure on China. Facilitating this visit and meeting this delegation were both welcome moves. India will need multiple strategies and decisive moves to contain a wily and belligerent neighbor like China. Staying with Indian diplomacy, New Delhi is hosting a very special guest, the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina. Now, I know what you're thinking. Didn't Hasina just visit India? Well, she did. She was among the leaders who attended Prime Minister Narendra Modi's swearing-in ceremony. And 2 weeks later, she's back here. And that in itself tells a story. Sheikh Hasina landed in New Delhi earlier today. She also met Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar. But tomorrow is a crucial day. She will get a ceremonial welcome at the Rashtrapati Bhavan. After that, she will hold bilateral talks with Prime Minister Modi. So Saturday is the moving day. And what can we expect? Let's talk symbolism first. This is the first incoming bilateral visit of Modi's third term. It tells you about India's priorities. As the Prime Minister says, it's neighborhood first. Secondly, Sheikh Hasina is visiting India before China. Her trip to Beijing was announced earlier this month. She's expected to travel in the second week of July. And before that, she's decided to come to India. What does that tell you? Dhaka too is showing its priorities. India before China. Now we come to the specifics. What are the expected outcomes? Reports say 10 agreements are in the pipeline. They cover multiple sectors like energy, connectivity, and trade. Some joint projects will also be announced, like the India-Bangladesh Friendship Bridge. It connects India's northeast to Ramgarh in Bangladesh. The idea is to give northeastern states access to the sea. Now, this project began in 2021. Hasina and Modi are expected to inaugurate it. Both leaders have clear expectations from this visit. Well, we look at Sheikh Hasina first. What are her expectations? Her biggest demand is a water sharing agreement for Teesta. Now, Teesta, as you would know, is a major river in South Asia. It originates in the Indian state of Sikkim. It flows via West Bengal and Bangladesh and finally empties into the Bay of Bengal. Right now, India gets almost 55% of Teesta's water, but Dhaka wants India to share more. Northern Bangladesh faces water shortage in the summer. So Hasina is pushing for a water sharing agreement. Just one problem though. West Bengal is not on board. Until the state government agrees, a deal cannot be struck, which is why Dhaka is pursuing alternatives, mainly a river restoration project. Bangladesh wants to improve Teesta's water flow. They want to dredge the river bed, build embankments, and reclaim land near the river. Again, just one problem. This project will cost a lot of money, around $1 billion. That will be the bill. China has already filed a proposal to do it for Bangladesh. The Chinese want to build it. And this has spooked India. Last month, New Delhi rushed its foreign secretary to Dhaka. He too expressed interest in this project. So water sharing is Sheikh Hasina's top demand. I guess it was expected. Bangladesh has more than 170 million people and most of them live near river basins. Now we come to Prime Minister Modi. What will be his expectations? mainly assurances. China's footprint has grown in Dhaka. They have invested close to $30 billion in Bangladesh. This money has gone into crucial projects like rail bridges and tunnels. Then you have loans. Dhaka owes around $17 billion to China and they want more money. Hasina has requested China for another loan. It's worth almost $5 billion. Even military contact is increasing. This year, China and Bangladesh held a joint military drill, the first such exercise by both countries. Now, if you add all of this up, one thing becomes very, very clear. Bangladesh cannot pick between India and China. It may prioritize India, but it cannot abandon China. That is why this visit is important. India's neighborhood policy has come under criticism. China has made significant gains in Nepal, the Maldives and Sri Lanka. So in many ways, Dhaka is the last ally standing. And that gives Sheikh Hasina a lot of leverage. It also puts the ball in New Delhi's court. Modi sent a positive signal by inviting India's neighbors to his inauguration. The key is to build on that. We'll be tracking this visit closely. Our next story is about a meeting that took place in Shanghai recently, a meeting between the US and China. These were informal talks, no government officials were involved. Nonetheless, they were important. It was the first such conversation in 5 years and it focused on one key aspect: nuclear weapons. America wanted to know two things. Will Beijing issue a nuclear threat over Taiwan? And does its no first use policy, does China's no first use policy still stand? And what was Beijing's response? Our next report tells you.
It was an intense discussion for 2 days. The setting was a conference room in a Shanghai hotel. On the US side, there were about half a dozen delegations that include former officials, even scholars. On Beijing's side too, it was a mix: scholars, analysts, and former PLA officers. So what were the two countries talking about? It was nuclear arms. The focus was mainly on Taiwan. China claims the island as part of its territory, a claim that Taipei refutes. In recent years, Beijing has ramped up its ante around Taiwan, whether it's through statements or military exercises. But is Beijing about to make a nuclear threat? Its officials say no. Washington raised concerns that if China was defeated in a conflict over Taiwan, it might use or even threaten to use nukes. But Beijing has denied any such claims. It's also given Washington reassurances. Reports claim its officials say it will not resort to atomic threats. Now, these are called Track 2 talks. The people taking part are former officials, even academics. They may not set policy, but they speak with authority on the government's position. So these are sort of semi-official talks. They are not Track 1 talks. Those are what happened between governments. In November last year, the countries resumed Track 1 talks on nuclear arms, but those discussions have stalled. So these Track 2 talks are a step in the right direction. These are the first informal talks between the US and China in 5 years, and it focuses on a key issue: nuclear arms. In the last century, the US and Russia ramped up their nuclear arsenal. China was far behind. It didn't focus on nukes, it focused on growth instead. China's first nuclear weapons test was in 1964. But since then, Beijing has built hundreds of nuclear weapons, yet called its arsenal modest. Beijing has stressed on two things: no first use, that is, it will never go first in a nuclear conflict. And the second is minimal deterrence, that is, having just enough nukes to dissuade adversaries. According to the Pentagon, Beijing is on track to double the number of its nuclear warheads by the end of the decade. So from 500 to 1,000 by 2030. Most of its nukes will likely be held at higher readiness levels. So a key question on the US side is, does China still stand by its no first use and minimal deterrence policies? Beijing says it's still business as usual. Nothing has changed. That's China's stance for now. But most analysts believe China's no first use policy is conditional. What those conditions are is something the world is yet to figure out.
What can one visit achieve? Well, if you're an isolated wartime leader, a lot. I'm talking about Vladimir Putin. He has wrapped up his much-hyped Asia tour. He visited two countries, North Korea and Vietnam, and tonight we are looking at the fallout. What has changed after Putin's visit? Well, South Korea is spooked. Moscow and Pyongyang have upgraded their ties. They now have a mutual defense pact, meaning Russia could give weapons to North Korea, maybe even strategic technology, which is why South Korea is lashing out.
And I would like to emphasize once again that any direct or indirect assistance or cooperation that enhances North Korea's military capability is a clear violation of the multiple UN Security Council resolutions. And it is indeed deplorable that a permanent member of the Security Council, which had agreed to the adoption of these resolutions, is now acting in violation of the resolutions.
Beyond the statement, Seoul has made two moves. First, they summoned Russia's ambassador. A formal protest was lodged. But the second move is even more important. South Korea is thinking about sending weapons to Ukraine. And this would be huge. Seoul has promised some $2.3 billion for Ukraine, but that is non-lethal aid. Nothing that can harm Russia or its soldiers. Non-lethal aid, $2.3 billion. But now South Korea is rethinking that, sort of like a tit for tat. You give weapons to our enemy, so we give weapons to yours. And Putin is not happy about this. He says arming Ukraine would be a serious mistake.
As for the supply of lethal weapons to the war zone in Ukraine, that would be a very big mistake. I hope that this will not happen. And if it does happen, then we will also take appropriate decisions, which are unlikely to please the current leadership of South Korea.
So Putin has stirred the pot, and things are already escalating. On Thursday, North Korean soldiers tried to cross the Korean border. In response, Seoul fired warning shots. It was a third such incident this month. You also had joint drills. South Korean and American warplanes combined forces. They practiced live fire exercises like firing laser-guided bombs and launching air-to-ground missiles. Basically, they tested their preparedness. But it's not just Korea. Putin made moves in Vietnam as well. The US is hoping to cultivate Vietnam as a key ally. Last year, Joe Biden visited this country. He upgraded bilateral relations with Hanoi. But Putin's visit has complicated matters. It has certainly made one thing clear: Vietnam will not abandon Russia.
There is a Russian proverb that all the money in the world cannot compare with a friendship, and one old friend is better than two new friends. The Vietnamese people are always deeply grateful and remember the close and loyal feelings of Russian friends in the context of many complicated developments in the world and region.
How about that? Vietnam's president used a Russian proverb to praise Russia. That doesn't sound like a US ally, and none of this is random. It's all part of Russia's long-term plan. There are three parts to it. The first is to tie the US down in Asia, whether it's in the Korean Peninsula or in the South China Sea or in Taiwan. If Biden is more focused on Asia, he is less focused on Ukraine. That is Putin's calculation.
We see what is happening in Asia. A bloc system is being put together. NATO is already moving to Asia as if to a permanent place of residence. This, of course, creates a threat to all countries in the region, including the Russian Federation. We are obliged to respond to this and will do it.
And he's right. Biden is sending a high-ranking diplomat to Vietnam this week. Why? To shore up the partnership. The second part is weakening America's Asian alliance. Two countries are key to this: South Korea and Japan. By visiting Pyongyang, Putin has already spooked Seoul. His next target is Japan. In March, Russia held military drills in the Sea of Japan. They've started another drill this week, again near Japan. Reports say around 40 warships, 40 warships are involved. Moscow is also reopening an old territorial dispute. It concerns an island near the Russian Far East. It's called Kuril Island. Russia occupies it, but Japan claims it. Last year, Moscow banned foreign ships from sailing near the Kuril Island. They basically told Japan, stay away. So Russia's strategic goal is quite clear: keep needling America's allies and eventually weaken their support for Ukraine, which brings us to the final part of Putin's plan: his pivot to the east. You see, Western markets are shut for Russia. Western investments are also not an option. So Putin is pivoting to Asia. Russia is the top seller of weapons to Vietnam. Meanwhile, India and China buy most of their energy. So Putin knows that his future lies in Asia, hence the focus. Of course, this is Putin's best-case scenario. Things could also backfire. His Asian adventures could embolden America's allies. It could make them more anti-Russia. I guess that's a risk that he's willing to take. But either way, one thing is clear. Putin's designs have just made Asia even more dangerous. We will see more military exercises, more defense spending, and more saber rattling. Now to another region where tensions are also escalating. This is West Asia. There's a risk of a wider war between Israel and Hezbollah. It's an Iran-backed group based in Lebanon, that is to the north of Israel, and they've been exchanging fire and threats. Yesterday, there were fresh airstrikes in Lebanon. Israeli forces hit Hezbollah targets. In response, Hezbollah launched dozens of rockets into northern Israel. And their chief has issued a warning. His name is Hassan Nasrallah. He says he won't spare Israel if there's an attack. Israeli officials say they're ready for an all-out war. But the thing is, Hezbollah is not Hamas. It's a bigger, better equipped and more powerful group. So is Israel biting more than it can chew? Can it fight a war on two fronts? Our next report explores.
Tension has returned to the streets of Beirut. Newspaper headlines are reflecting the bleak mood. After the warning from the Hezbollah chief, the locals are afraid about a wider conflict breaking out. Among them is 32-year-old Tara Tabet.
The situation is a little disgusting because when you see everything that happened from 8 months to now, I don't understand how no one has stopped them. And of course we don't want to go into a war with them, but if that's solidarity with the people in Gaza, so be it.
Tensions on Lebanon's southern borders remains high. Israel and the Hezbollah continue to trade fire. Yesterday, the Israeli forces claimed that they struck more Hezbollah bases. The Lebanese group responded with more rockets. Both sides have been exchanging fire for months now. But in recent weeks, these strikes have intensified. So has the war of words. Israel is now dropping hints it is not afraid of a full-blown offensive.
We are completing the land and air readiness, strengthening the intelligence systems, and preparing for any possibility. We have to remember the basic situation, that Hezbollah started a war against us. We have an obligation to change the situation in the north.
But compared to the Hamas, the Hezbollah is a far more formidable enemy. For starters, Hezbollah has a bigger arsenal. With the assistance of allies like Iran, Russia and Syria, the Hezbollah has accumulated at least 130,000 rockets and missiles. Potentially, this stockpile can overwhelm Israel's air defenses. Earlier this week, the Hezbollah issued a grim reminder of these capabilities. They released a video which is believed to be surveillance footage. It features prominent Israeli locations, Israeli military sites, residential cities with high populations of civilians, malls and high-rise buildings, and the port of Haifa. On the ground, Hezbollah has a large number of fighters. In 2021, their chief, Hassan Nasrallah, had claimed that the group had some 100,000 fighters, but it is widely believed that more fighters have joined the ranks since. They are unfazed by Israel's threats. Earlier this month, an Israeli strike killed a senior Hezbollah commander. At his funeral, the group issued a rallying call.
If the enemy, as is broadcast by media outlets every day, the enemy is screaming and moaning about what happened to him in northern Palestine, let him prepare himself to cry and wail.
The Hezbollah sees its cross-border attacks as low-intensity conflict, designed to convey their support for Hamas. Only a truce in Gaza can put a permanent end to these hostilities. But with the chances of a ceasefire fading, the risk of an Israel-Hezbollah escalation remains high.
Our next story is about Senegal. It's a nation in West Africa, one of the many former French colonies in the region and one of the many that are angry with France. So it may be surprising to see this happen. That was Senegal's recently elected president, Bassirou Diomaye Faye. He met French President Emmanuel Macron yesterday at the Élysée Palace in Paris. A few months ago, this would have been surprising because of the hostilities between Macron and the new Senegalese government. Faye became president in April. Just days after he was released from prison, Faye had been imprisoned by Senegal's former president, Macky Sall, a leader perceived to have been close to France and Macron. And it wasn't just Faye who was in prison, it was also his political mentor, Ousmane Sonko, who Faye made Prime Minister of Senegal. Sonko is the Prime Minister now. Listen to this to get an idea of their anger towards Macron.
And worst of all, it was at the height of this persecution that President Macron welcomed President Macky Sall to congratulate him on having done what he had to do to save his country. It's an incitement to repression.
Instead of criticizing Senegal's former president for repression, Macron congratulated Sall for imprisoning opposition leaders like Sonko and Faye. Now, that's one reason for the anti-France sentiment in Senegal. The other is more deep-rooted. You see, Senegal became independent in 1960, but for decades, it has been dependent on the French for everything from trade to security to even their currency. And this is no accident. It was by design, a way to enforce close ties between France and its former colonies. But this spell has started to break. A number of former French colonies saw military coups recently. Since 2021, the military has taken over Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. All three nations then confronted the French and demanded that French troops leave their soil. Senegal did not have a coup, but the new government has the same sensibilities. Last month, Prime Minister Sonko said, and I'm quoting, "I reiterate Senegal's wish to determine its course which is incompatible with the entrenched presence of foreign military bases." Senegal is also planning to oust the French army. There are about 350 French troops in this country. President Faye and Prime Minister Sonko want them out. Reports say that a plan is already in motion to reduce that number to 100, from 350 to 100. So with all of this in mind, let's look at the meeting between Macron and Faye again. You can see that Macron is vying for a good photo op. He's asking Faye to turn and face the camera. Shake his hand. The Senegalese president does not seem really interested, but he's playing along. Why would he bother with all of this? Perhaps because President Faye is looking at the bigger picture. Macron was hosting a summit, an African vaccine summit. It was an opportunity for Senegal and other African nations.
Africa produces only 2% of the vaccines it uses. Our goal is to produce 60% of these vaccines by 2040.
The disparity is bleak. It is one of the reasons that the African continent has a low vaccination rate and why infant mortality is high. Macron announced a $1.2 billion program to boost vaccine production in the African continent. So it seems that Faye decided it was worth it to play nice. It ties in with Senegal's bigger strategy, trying to unite African nations and change the dynamics of their relationship with the West. Faye has been saying this since he took office.
I will always be available to work with you, our European partners, towards a win-win partnership that is mutually beneficial for our respective peoples.
Senegal isn't going for the scorched earth tactic. It isn't planning to sever ties with France and the West. It wants to redefine those ties and turn them into win-win propositions instead of the current exploitative relationship. Hopefully, Senegal succeeds with this plan. Now let's turn to the other side of Africa, to Kenya in the east. The nation has been rocked by protests this week, and today they turned deadly. At least one person has died and hundreds of others have been injured. This occurred as the protests spread to every corner of Kenya. The people are protesting against new taxes. Kenya's government wants to raise an extra $2.7 billion in the next financial year, and it plans to do this by hiking taxes. Yesterday, Kenya's new finance bill passed its second reading, meaning the taxes are a step closer to becoming law. That is why the protests have intensified and now turned deadly. Here's our report.
Nairobi, Eldoret, Kisumu. All over Kenya, you can hear people chant, "Ruto must go." The Kenyans are talking about their president, William Ruto. That's not his only name in Kenya, though. He has also been likened to a biblical tax collector, Zacchaeus, or Zakayo as he's known in Kenya. Ruto is often compared to this figure because of his penchant for taxation. The protests that you see are directed against new taxes, brought in via this year's finance bill, which is like Kenya's annual budget.
Order. Honorable members, the results of the division on second reading of the Finance Bill 2024 is as follows. Ayes 204, nays 115, abstentions nil, so the ayes have it. Order. Take your seats.
The Finance Bill 2024 passed a second reading in Parliament yesterday. It's one step closer to becoming a law, which is what sparked the latest round of demonstrations. And the latest police retaliation. The police have been attacking the protesters with tear gas, water cannons, and, according to some reports, even bullets. At least one person is dead. Hundreds of people have been injured. The Kenyan protesters are mostly Gen Z. They're young, tech-savvy and informed. They organize through social media.
Social media, I'm telling you, Ogopa Gen Z. Ogopa Gen Z. Can you see these guys? Like, Ogopa Gen Z. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, everywhere online.
The protests broke out on Tuesday and initially seemed to have worked. The Kenyan government withdrew some of the more controversial taxes, like a 16% tax on bread. But the Kenyan protesters aren't convinced.
We don't deny there are things that they changed in the finance bill, but as understood, they changed from one tax to another.
The protesters don't want the finance bill amended. They want it rejected outright. But Kenya's president looks set to fight them till the end.
So help me God.
William Ruto became president in 2022, and every year he raises taxes borne by the common people. Taxes on food, fuel, and even medical treatments. Ruto wants to tax it all. His reason isn't the worst. Kenya has a high debt burden. Ruto inherited much of it from the previous administration, and he wants to lower it. To do that, he needs money. But here's the problem. The burden of Ruto's taxes falls on everyone, including the poor and marginalized, and especially the salaried class. Kenyans have been suffering through a cost of living crisis. Many can barely make ends meet as it is. And on top of all this come Ruto's taxes. The taxes have broken the backs of local businesses. They keep shutting down by the hundreds. The people are hurting, and they feel that Ruto and his government aren't doing their part. The president has been under scrutiny for frequent foreign trips, sometimes aboard luxury jets, on the taxpayers' dime. So the message from the protesters is simple.
Cut on your expenditure. Do not overtax us. That's the laziest way for the government to earn revenue, overtaxation.
Ruto doesn't seem likely to take this advice. His finance bill is going through the motions. There will be a third and final hearing on the bill this coming Tuesday. Then it'll head to Ruto's office for his signature. Kenya's anti-tax protesters don't have much time left, so expect the demonstrations to get bigger in the days ahead.
What do you think about when I say fast food? Big burgers, a huge bag of fries, maybe a can of soda to go with it. Fast food is all about big offers and even bigger promotions. But weight loss drugs could be changing that. Globally, over 1 billion people are obese, many more are overweight. Millions of them are taking weight loss drugs now, the likes of Ozempic, Wegovy, Eli Lilly and many more. These drugs suppress your appetite. That means people are eating less Their tastes are changing and they're choosing healthier alternatives, and it's changing the way the food industry works. From snacks to grocery staples, companies are launching new products to make it more diet-friendly. Our next report tells you how.
Once upon a time, all was well in the kingdom of cholesterol. It was an empire of excess, and reigning supreme was just one thing: fast food. Big burgers, bigger fries, and the idea of diet soda would make people cringe. Fast food was all the rage: cheap, satisfying, and incredibly filling. But deep-fried land now has a new enemy. It's weight loss drugs, the likes of Ozempic and Wegovy. More and more people are turning to these appetite-suppressing wonders. And why wouldn't they? Globally, 1.1 billion people are obese. That's 14% of the global population. By 2035, over half of the world's population, 4 billion people, will be overweight or obese. Weight loss drugs have shown promise. They have been swift in helping people lose weight. But that's not to say they haven't had side effects. They do. In fact, the WHO has issued a global alert. It was issued over fake Ozempic drugs. The global body said the fake medicines could pose a danger to health. But, warning or not, people are still using them. Now, most of these drugs have a common feature: they suppress appetite. When you consume them, you feel very full after meals, and then you start shedding the kilos. But that doesn't mean you don't eat with weight loss drugs. You do, but you just eat smaller portions. And that's what companies are now catering to. Take Nestle, for example. It's launching a new line of frozen meals for people taking weight loss medications. They will be high in protein, they will have more fiber and nutrients, but Nestle is not naming the weight loss drug. Then there are others like BioCare, a drink that's particularly catering to people taking weight loss drugs. These drugs have gastrointestinal side effects, so the maker says the drink will alleviate the side effects for people taking semaglutides. Again, no direct mention of weight loss drugs. But some, like Herbalife, are more direct. They mention GLP-1 drugs and how their product can help people who are taking them. And it's not just specifically catered products. Weight loss drugs could change the entire food industry. According to a new report, grocery spending has dropped by almost 9% in households that use weight loss drugs. And guess what's taking the biggest hit? It's snacks and sweets. The consumption of soft drinks, baked goods, and salty snacks could fall up to 3% by 2035. So it's clear that the food industry is undergoing a seismic shift. It's driven by the rise of weight loss drugs and the changing tastes of a more health-conscious public. Whether this will lead to a fitter society remains to be seen. But one thing is for certain: the days of guilt-free indulgence are behind us, and the future of food is where less is more.
Have you heard about greenwashing? It is everywhere and it is effective because it is a marketing spin. Companies mislead consumers about their environmental credentials, and it's difficult to see through such claims, which makes greenwashing successful. So successful that now it is lending the same strategy to other corporate claptrap, like gender washing. Now, this is a relatively new term and it works exactly like greenwashing. Over the past few years, gender washing has seen a dramatic rise. More companies are claiming that they support gender equality. They're committing to increase gender balance. They're touting gender diverse leadership. They're curating women's summits, press conferences, equality podcasts. But are they walking the talk? Are they practicing what they preach? Not particularly. According to research, these commitments are not translating into reality. There is little progress, and in some cases, it's one step forward followed by 2 steps back. Look at the US, for example. 2023 was almost historic for women in the US workforce, but in a really bad way. Across all C-suite positions, women lost seats for the first time in 2 decades. Women's representation across senior leadership roles saw a drop. The growth rate fell to its lowest in more than a decade. It dropped to 0.5% in 2023 as compared to 1.2% average in the years prior. So the rate was poor from the get-go, and now it has become worse. So much for all the tall claims on gender parity. And this is not an isolated scenario. In fact, it is better than the situation in many other countries. In the US, women hold 27% of C-suite positions, C-suite roles, 27% of them. In the UK, this number stands at 25%, in France, 24%, Germany, 19%, India, 15%. If these numbers look bad, trust me, it gets worse. Because C-suite is a broad term. It includes all upper levels of management, like chief finance officer or marketing officer. As you go up the ranks to chief executive officer, gender equality becomes increasingly invisible. Globally, only 5.4% CEOs are women, so there is a clear disconnect here. Companies are committing to better gender balance, but women's participation remains stubbornly low. Why is that? I'll give you 3 reasons why. First, many of these claims are hollow. Empty promises are made to get stakeholders off the company's back. The second reason is the labor market itself. It has certain dynamics. There are entrenched biases, stereotypes, and ways of working. Undoing even some of this needs more than bold public claims, because words mean nothing if they're not backed by actions. Which brings me to the third reason, gender equity fatigue. Most companies have what they call DEI initiatives. DEI stands for Diversity, Equity and Inclusion, DEI. In the past few years, DEI has become a legal and political target. Many say that it is a waste of time and money. Others believe it should not even exist, because the inclusion of women would lead to the exclusion of men, which is not true at all. But when top CEOs like Elon Musk criticize diversity and inclusion publicly, logic goes out the window, and such actions come with repercussions. For starters, reputation takes a hit, because empty promises are not a good look. Then there are the financial consequences. Study after study proves this. Firms with more women in senior positions are more profitable, more socially responsible, more innovative, and more resilient. The funny thing is, most people want the same thing. They want competitive organizations. They want successful leaders, meritocracy. This in itself should be a rallying call for gender equality. Instead, it takes the shape of an empty promise. Because it is easy to say the right thing, but doing the right thing takes a lot of work. And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. The world's largest collection of Shakespeare's works, printed 400 years ago, goes on display in the United States. Wildfires in New Mexico damage hundreds of homes, causing 8,000 residents to evacuate. And it's not Zorro or a Ninja Turtle. It's French football player Kylian Mbappe. He's back to practice with a mask after he broke his nose in the opening Euro match. Finally, we're taking you back in history. On this day in 1990, a massive earthquake devastated Iran. Nearly 50,000 people were killed, more than 150,000 were injured, and millions were left homeless. Iran received assistance and aid from across the globe, including from the United States. We're leaving you on that note. Thanks for watching. Have a great weekend.
On the 15th and 16th of June, world leaders from almost 100 nations gathered in Switzerland. The only thing on the agenda was Ukraine. As the Russian invasion continues, Vladimir Putin's troops continue to march westward. Villages and towns around Kharkiv have been captured by Russian troops. Ukrainian soldiers are outnumbered and outgunned. Volodymyr Zelensky struggles to push back against Putin's aggression. The Swiss summit was supposed to bring an end to the war, except Russia was not involved. So Putin made his own moves. Just one day before the Ukraine peace summit began, Putin put forward two conditions for a ceasefire. First, the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the eastern regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia. And second, for Ukraine to abandon its plans to join NATO. Putin says that this is the best deal he can offer.
As soon as Kyiv declares that it is ready for such a decision and begins the actual withdrawal of troops from these regions, as well as officially notifies that they abandon plans to join NATO, an order to cease fire and begin negotiations will immediately follow from our side, literally at the same minute.
For the first time in over 2 years, Putin put forward his demands for a ceasefire. But Ukraine and the West were quick to reject them.
You cannot trust such messages. Putin follows the same path. Today he is talking about 4 regions. Before it was Crimea and Donbass.
Russian President Vladimir Putin is proposing is ultimately to put his imperialist raid into documents. What we need is not a dictatorial peace, but a fair, just peace that focuses on the integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine.
After being snubbed by the West, Putin set out to grab global attention. With the world focused on G7 and the Ukraine Peace Summit, 4 Russian warships entered America's backyard, the Atlantic Ocean. They were on their way to Cuba. And it didn't take long for Putin to send a message to Joe Biden. Out of the 4 warships, one was the Kazan nuclear-powered submarine. And the other was the Admiral Gorshkov frigate. Upon entering the waters of the Atlantic Ocean, both the Kazan and the Gorshkov conducted live-fire drills. They fired long-range missiles at mock targets almost 600 kilometers away. The United States tracked the missile launches. Washington even put its Navy on alert. But the White House played down the Russian antics and said that Putin's warships were no serious threat. After flexing in the Atlantic Ocean, Putin's warships reached Cuba. They were docked in the Caribbean nation's capital, Havana, and locals lined up to get a glimpse of the Russian warships. Even Cuba's president, Miguel Díaz-Canel, visited the Russian flotilla and met Putin's troops.
I saw it, a submarine, and I said, wow, and I took a picture. I have never seen a submarine in Havana in my life. On the internet, I follow a group that talks about submarines. For me, it's a unique thing. I've never seen it before in my life. Impressive.
From impeachments to inaugurations, if it's a political story, we are on the scene. The race for the White House is heating up.
We're beating Biden.
How dare he say that?
If it's breaking news, we're live with the latest coverage. From the White House, the State Department, and Capitol Hill. We know the issues, but above all, we know the players to bring you the latest in-depth analysis on all the key stories that we're covering. I'm Eric Ham. Join me from Washington here on First Post America.